Am I on? Oh. All right. So, these microphones. If it weren't for the recording, that might not be taking place. I'm not sure. I would ask to not use a microphone because I am pretty loud. My entire life, my entire family has called me the loudest one around. But before we get started, I need to first off apologize. The sermon tonight's going to be a little, probably not as good as it should be. I should put it that way, because I thought all week that next Sunday was the Sunday in which I was preaching. So I had thought this week and had it written down, just the topic of the sermon written down. And so next week I'll get it all put together and be ready to go by next Sunday. And my beautiful bride told me that I would be preaching this Sunday. And I said, no, I'm not preaching till the 7th, which is today. So, wife is always right. So, the first thing I want to do is just open us up in prayer. So if y'all would join me in prayer. Heavenly Father, God, we love you so much tonight. Lord, I am so honored again to be up here proclaiming your word. Lord, I pray right now that you do, in fact, remove me from this, Lord, and that you just take over and speak through my mouth to everyone in here, including myself. Lord, would you just create in all of us a clean heart and provide open ears so that we can hear your message tonight. Thank you for everything you're going to do. I thank you for everything you've done, Lord, and I thank you for just blessing us so abundantly. I also pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So I'm going to talk to you guys about something that's near and dear to my heart. I feel like I'm really loud, but they can probably fix that. I wanted to talk to you guys about, I guess, missions. And my hero of all time has got to be Paul. The story of Paul was one of those stories that as a kid was my favorite to do in children's church. Coloring in Paul. I remember coloring in Paul's picture whenever he was watching Stephen be stoned. The story of Stephen. I remember coloring in Paul when he is in the Roman jail. I remember learning all of these stories. And I remember Miss beautiful Mary Etheridge, beating them. Not figuratively, but she actually had to smack me a couple of times to get them into my head so that I would remember these stories. And children's church, where I was from, was cyclical. So every year, you did the same thing. The first Sunday in March, you did this. The second Sunday in March, you did this. There was a fifth Sunday, was the one time you got an oddball. So I remember doing the same stories every year, and I remember learning them, and then learning them, and learning them. And something stuck out in my mind as a kid. It stuck out to me that Paul was mentioned in the story of Stephen. But I didn't really get any more details of that, other than Paul was also mentioned later in a jail. So there's a big gap there missing. And that big gap that was missing is what we know as Paul's testimony. Possibly one of the most powerful stories of change in the entire New Testament. And Paul's testimony is what fueled his mission work. So tonight, I want to talk to all of y'all and to myself about testimonies. Because testimonies is probably your best weapon of proclaiming the gospel. And everyone in here has a fantastic, amazing, blessed testimony, just we don't know how to use it. We don't know how to tell somebody else. We get so scared when the opportunity arises where we are able to tell someone else about Jesus Christ. That oftentimes we keep our mouths shut because we're more afraid to do it and mess up than we are to do it and let God take over. So the easiest thing to do is to use your testimony. And so tonight we're going to look first at what a testimony is. Testimony, interestingly enough, is defined as a formal written / spoken statement. And it's usually used in the court of law. A testimony is a formal or written statement that is usually used in the court of law. It's factual. It is held up to be true. And Paul, interestingly enough, in Acts chapter 26, has to do just that. He has to give a testimony. And it's pretty interesting. So if you join me first in Acts chapter 21, at the very end of Acts chapter 21, you'll see that throughout the book of Acts, the later part of Acts, we're following Paul. And when you get to chapter 21, I'm not going to read directly from 21, so be ready to flip. But in chapter 21, Paul gets in trouble. He gets arrested. In chapter 21, Verse 27 says, when 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the crowd, and they seized him. So, chapter 21, Paul is arrested. Now, when Paul is arrested, he is then taken before the governing officials. And at this point, where Paul is at, he is under Roman rule, under Roman control. So, if you would join me in Acts chapter 22, we're going to look at the very end of the chapter, beginning with verse 22. Acts 22. And I'm going to read for us just verses 27 through 29 for time's sake. But in Acts chapter 22, beginning at verse 22, Paul is proclaiming his Roman citizenship. And in verse 27, he says, the commander went to Paul and asked, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? Paul replied, yes, I am. Then the commander said, I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship. Paul replied, but I was born a citizen. And those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed, and he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. That was Acts chapter 22, right there at the end. Paul was arrested and then announced his status as a Roman. I have had a bunch of history classes in my life because I was a 5-year student getting a 4-year degree, so I took a bunch of extra classes and paying for them right now. But a lot of those extra classes were all history classes, and one of them in particular was early Roman history. How appropriate that somebody who's going to study the Bible would take a class like that. God knew what he was doing, I didn't. But in early Roman history, you learn that Rome is one of the first countries to authorize citizenship. And not only authorize citizenship, but to put weight into citizenship. As a United States citizen, we have a bunch of rights, right? The Bill of Rights. We've got documents saying you can do this, you can't do that. If we get in trouble with somebody else, we can be brought back to the United States. There's a bunch of rights that we have as a United States citizen. Well, Paul had some rights as a Roman citizen. And one of them was right to trial. And by having right to trial, Paul could do something known as appealing to Caesar. We would call that appealing to the Supreme Court. So I read a book called Gideon's Trumpet. And in Gideon's Trumpet is a guy who was wrongly accused, and he's in jail, but he could not afford a lawyer. And so he is appealing his court case. And he has to study enough law to appeal his own court case, to be his own lawyer, to get all the way to the Supreme Court, for the Supreme Court to rule, one, that he was innocent, and two, that everybody deserved to have a lawyer. That's Gideon versus Wainwright. It's the court case. Paul was using that. He was using that appeal to Caesar. And so when he's arrested here, he is taken before the Sanhedrin, and he says, guys, I want a real court case. I'm a Roman citizen. I have rights, and I want a real court case. So then Paul is taken to the next step. He's taken to Rome. A Roman court case has to take place in Rome. So when he's taken to Rome, Paul is doing two things at once. One, he is accomplishing the mission that he has set out for himself, which is to get the gospel to Rome. Two, he is being willing to put his life on the line to defend his Christ. Which is pretty amazing, which is another reason why I really love Paul. So if you would join me now in Acts chapter 26, and we'll actually get started with the sermon. Acts chapter 26. I'm not going to read for you all of chapter 26. It's 32 verses. So we're going to pick and choose. And I am going to start off just really quickly with Acts chapter 26, verses 1 through 3. Paul has come before King Agrippa, who is a ruler who sent him on to Caesar, but he's come before King Agrippa, and then it says, Acts chapter 26, verse 1, then Agrippa said to Paul, you have permission to speak for yourself. As a Roman citizen, he legally was allowed to speak for himself, to defend himself in the court of law. That's exactly what he did. But we all know who Paul is. And we all know that when Paul is able to speak for himself, he's really going to speak for Jesus. And it's pretty cool to see what Paul does. He says, so Paul motioned with his hand. This is what my mom does all the time when she talks. She's talking with her hands. But he motioned with his hand and began his defense. King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews. And especially so because you are so well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. Paul has gone before King Agrippa, and he's ready to give his defense. And the last thing he says is, I know who you are, and I know how smart you are, and I'm going to speak to you. So the first thing we learn about a testimony tonight is that you got to identify some things. Paul was really, really good at identifying things in his testimony and identifying what needed to be done and who needed to be spoken to. The first thing that he identifies is the people around him. And there was a pretty serious lack of Jesus in this area. Paul is speaking before a Roman court. And the people who are persecuting him, the people who are putting him there, are Jewish. Neither Romans nor Jews were Christians. What a grand opportunity for Paul. He was presented the privilege to speak in front of a room of people where not a single one would have been Christian. He was given the floor. He was told, you may speak. Some powerful words. He may speak. And the people he is speaking to, one, King Agrippa, he perchance knew King Agrippa. Not so much personally, but they knew each other. And not only that, all the people persecuting him were people he grew up with. When he was learning to be the Jew of Jews that he claims to be, that he was. They're all people that know him. So not only is he getting to speak to people who are not Christian, but it's also peers, people he knows. So the first thing that Paul does is identify a lack of Jesus, and he identifies that exactly who he is speaking to. Identifies the group of people in which he is speaking to. Now, it wouldn't make much sense if I was getting ready to give my testimony. To give my testimony to a group of children and talk about a life of drug addiction and pain and losing a spouse and all this other kind of stuff, if I'm giving my testimony to a bunch of 5-year-olds. Right? Everyone here can agree that speaking about drug addiction would go way over the head of a 5-year-old. They would have no clue what you're talking about. However, if I was giving that same testimony to 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, that would click. It would make sense. They would know where that's coming from. And in the same thing, it would not make sense to talk to a senior citizen about getting upset when you lose your piece of bubble gum. Right? As if I were talking to a 4-year-old and telling them about how losing that piece of bubble gum has nothing in comparison to when Jesus lost his life and he had to give up something for us. The testimony would work, but only to the group of people in which you were speaking to. Paul is speaking to a group of people, and he knows exactly how to address them. So the first thing we've got to do, if we want to have a useful testimony, if we want to be able to tell someone else about Jesus Christ and what he's done in our lives, we've got to know who to talk to. When I was in Peru, it's pretty interesting. This whole entire sermon stems from my time in Peru when I really felt the call to be in the ministry. I had to speak daily to people who did not speak English. So it was pretty mandatory that, one, I spoke Spanish. And two, I had to know their customs. I had to know what they did. I had to know how they treated each other. I had to know that when an abuela, a little grandmother, abuelita, walks into the room, she's going to kiss you on the cheek. Be warned, be prepared. And at 6'4", it's a long way down. Right? And also, don't mess up and look at them when they're trying to kiss you, because you will make lip-to-lip contact. And it's funny to everyone in the room. But I had to know how to address the people that I was speaking to, the people that I was in their country, I was in their place. I looked around, and every time I went to a school to give my testimony or to translate, I had to know what words to use. Not to use the words maybe I had learned in college, but to use words that I had learned when I was in high school, the Spanish words that I learned then, that were more basic if I'm speaking at a school. If I'm speaking to a group of adults, to maybe pull on some of those collegiate words, so that way they would understand what I'm saying and my testimony, or whatever I'm translating, can get by and get through to them. Paul does exactly that here in Acts chapter 26. So the first thing he does is identify who he is talking to. Then he gets on their level. He gets on the level of the Jewish people, the Roman citizens, all the way up to King Agrippa himself. Now that's impressive. He's talking to commoners, He's talking to the higher class of Jews, and he's talking to the king of the area, the ruler of the area, King Agrippa. But he doesn't. He gets on their level. And Paul is given the opportunity to speak. And the most important thing that you have to remember with your testimony is it does no good if you never open your mouth. Paul was given the opportunity to speak, and he snatched it out of the air and ran with it. And that's where we fall short. It's where I have fallen short, for sure. I know my testimony. I know the story of how Jesus saved my life. And I can very easily tell somebody else. But a lot of times I zip my lips and go about my own business. Paul did it. Man, am I glad he did it. Paul did it. When he was given the opportunity to speak, he took it. After this, Paul identified better with the people who were listening to him. And he identified to them that they had a lack of Jesus. So we already talked that they obviously weren't Christian. We already talked that it's Romans and it's Jewish people. And he somehow has to be able to give his testimony in a manner that reaches to all of them. So if you would join me in looking at verses, and I have notes everywhere on this piece of paper. This is what happens when you don't get prepared. There we go. Acts chapter 26, verses 24 through 27. At this point, Acts chapter 26, verses 24 through 27. At this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense, Paul's testimony. He interrupted Paul's testimony. He says, "You are out of your mind, Paul. Your great learning is driving you insane." And this is coming from a Roman. Romans admired somebody who learned. So he says, "You have learned so much that you've gone crazy." And Paul responded, "I am not insane, most excellent Festus." Again, he knows who he's talking to. Festus is a high-ranking official. "Most excellent Festus." Paul replied, "What I am saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I am convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because it was not done in a corner or done in hiding. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do." King Agrippa had proclaimed to be someone who knew of, he had learned of the Jewish customs. And not only did he know of them, he abided by a lot of them. King Agrippa knew all about Jewish customs. In fact, when a court case that had to do with Jew versus Roman came up, he was the one who took it over. He knew so much about it. He was the expert in the matter. And so Paul, like I said earlier, knew exactly who he was talking to. And he is pleading to, number one, King Agrippa here. Everyone else in the room is going to be included, but number one is King Agrippa. And he knows exactly what he's saying, and he's trying his hardest to reach this person, King Agrippa. And when he's talking to him, he says right then, "I know what you know. And you know that what I'm saying is true." And now Festus is somebody who doesn't know these customs, and he's calling him insane. He's saying, "Man, what you're saying is just jibber-jabber." But Paul had just told them the testimony of him walking along the road of Damascus, of him getting blinded while speaking to Jesus Christ, and him having to go seek out Didymus so that he could have the scales removed from his eyes. He told him that story. And he quoted the prophets. And he quotes things throughout the Old Testament so that all the Jewish people, and King Agrippa himself, would know that what he is saying is true. He's matching up to them. He's providing a testimony. Yes, you've got to remember, the entire time he is doing this, he is first and foremost defending himself in public. He is in court. But it's pretty amazing to me that while Paul was given the opportunity to speak, he did not let it only be his defense testimony. But it began to be his true testimony. He began to witness for Jesus Christ. So if you look at verses 19 through 23, you will see that Paul identifies the next thing that he identifies as what a life in Jesus looks like. He says, "So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven, first to those in Damascus, and then to those in Jerusalem and all in Judea, and then to the Gentiles. I preached that they should repent and that they should turn to God and demonstrate their repentance by their deeds. That is why some Jews seized me in the temple courts and tried to kill me. But God helped me to this very day. So I stand here to testify to small and to great alike. I am saying nothing beyond what the prophets and Moses said would happen. That the Messiah would suffer, and as the first to rise from the dead, he would bring the message of life to his own people and to the Gentiles. Paul was expressing there what a life of Jesus looks like in his own life. He says, I know what they're doing. I know why they seized me. This is what I'm saying. This is what happened in my life. And this is what happened when God takes over your life. He says, I'm here and I'm safe. There had already been multiple plots to kill Paul. But they all fell through. And they all fell through because he got arrested, interestingly enough. When he got arrested, he got put into Roman control, Roman custody, and was protected from the assassination attempts. So Paul knew God was protecting him. And he was able to tell the people, this is what happens when you're living a life focused on Christ. So you've got to remember, Paul is expressing his testimony. He is sharing Jesus Christ with them about his own life. He's using his life as the key to open up the door to someone else's heart, which is key for us when we're giving our testimony. A lot of us, myself included, like I said earlier, have a tendency to want to keep our mouths shut. But if we just told someone about how Jesus has affected us, that could be the only thing that they need to hear. God will do the rest. Amen. Paul identified the people that was listening to him. Paul identified and showed them what a life with Jesus looked like. Paul could not be what he was without the help of God. He knew that. And he told King Agrippa that. And it's pretty amazing that after he does all of this, verse 28 comes on. Then King Agrippa said to Paul, do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to become a Christian? King Agrippa knew what was up. He caught on. He knew what Paul was trying to do. And it was evident what Paul was trying to do, to the point of King Agrippa calling him out on it. And it's pretty amazing to me that King Agrippa doesn't look at him and says, you're not succeeding in trying to lead me to Christ. You're not succeeding in trying to get me to be a Christian. In fact, he just says to him, are you trying to do this in this rapid moment, in this such a short time, trying to lead me to Christ? And Paul responds with some of my favorite words to be penned by Luke that come out of the mouth of Paul. Beautiful. Paul replied in verse 29, short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for the chains. His prayer, and he let everyone around him know it, is that they would all become Christians. The people, very people persecuting you. And that sounds so much like Jesus Christ on the cross when he's being murdered. And he's praying for the people around him, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they're doing. Paul is saying, my prayer is that all of you persecuting you, that you hearing my trial, that you who I'm talking to, every one of you, could become like me, a Christian. So during Paul's testimony, he uses his testimony to give his testimony. His legal right was to have a testimony, to defend himself. His Christian right, which we are all given, is to use our testimony to try to lead someone else to Christ. So Paul uses the testimony, his defense, to use his testimony to try to lead those around him to Christ. And he gives a wonderful example of how to use our testimony. He identified exactly who he was speaking to. He identified what they knew, what they believed, and what would work. And then he identified that they had a lack of Jesus. That Jesus was not evident in any of their lives. And the last thing he identified, or he showed them, was what a life full of Jesus looks like. And if you want proof that it works, then again I urge you just to read what was said in verse 28. Whenever he says, are you trying to persuade me to be a Christian? The point got across. And it's amazing. If you skip all the way down to verse 32, the last thing that is recorded there before Paul sets sail to Rome, says, King Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. King Agrippa found no fault in him. and was going to dismiss the court case. But the only reason he couldn't was because Paul had appealed to Caesar. He had asked to take it to the Supreme Court, if you will. King Agrippa's kind of like the district court, and he was going all the way. Paul, like I said, ultimate goal was to get to Rome. He was a missionary whose heart was for the lost. He was a missionary who was not afraid to use his testimony. And he's a missionary who showed us, who showed me, how to use mine. And I know that tonight it's an interesting crowd that I'm talking to, but I will say that everyone in here has a wonderful testimony that we don't use enough. Because if we used it like Paul did, this place would be packed. If I used it like Paul did, just me, like Paul did, this place would be packed. So I couldn't imagine what it would look like if we all did. Because without Paul, we probably wouldn't have ever heard the gospel. Because of Paul's missionary trip to Rome, the gospel got spread rapidly, enormously, throughout the Roman Empire. And he did it all by using his testimony, by using that life-changing event that God provided for him. If I want to tell someone about Jesus, my own personal testimony is my most reliable weapon. And according to the Great Commission, we should all want to tell somebody about Jesus. But the fact is that I am too scared to do so. And I got one quote before I end off. It comes from C.H. Spurgeon, who Pastor Jeff likes and a lot of other people like, but I do too, like Charles H. Spurgeon. It says, every Christian is either a missionary or an apostle. So, that's all I got. Join me in prayer, please. Heavenly Father God, we love you so much tonight, Lord. We are so thankful to be in your presence. Lord, and I'm thankful for Paul and the work that you did through him so that the gospel can reach someone like me. Lord, I pray right now for forgiveness for every person in this room. Lord, forgiveness for me. Lord, for all the sins that I've committed, just so, Lord, that I can just see a glimpse of your glory. I thank you for providing us the opportunity to get here this evening. And I pray right now that you take care of everyone on their way home. Lord, I love you. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. And I pray that you do it again soon. All this in the name of Jesus Christ.